Good morning, everybody. My name's Roger Gomm. My apologies for not being with you today. I was pre-booked some time in advance where I'm working for the UK Cabinet Office, supporting Ukraine with the development of both national and regional risk registers. Unavoidable. My apologies again. Just very quickly, my background is that I was a police officer in London for 34 years. I retired in 2012. I now do a variety of things, including working for the Emergency Planning College, as I think it says on your screen, and a range of other things. I ran a series of workshops on crisis management, and what I'd like to do very quickly is share the key points, really. When I say key points, it's what engaged the audience, what generated questions and discussion. So I won't give you every subject, but I'm just going to try and highlight those areas that, as I say, the audience engaged with. The aim of the workshops was really, as on the screen there, to examine crisis management, reflecting on the ability of the police service to maintain operational efficiency under the stress of external changes. That is actually taken from resilience, which is actually what everybody is trying to achieve, I hope. The first subject that generated a lot of debate was this types of incidents. And if you imagine we had an international audience from many countries, we looked at the various incident definitions, I think. And the ones that seemed to fit and had some agreement were these four on the screen there. So you had a standard incident. This could be something like a fire alarm, perhaps a routine traffic collision, insecure premises. Then it moves up to this sort of routine emergency. One of the examples was an emergency landing at an airport. Quite routine, standard procedures, quite easy to follow. That was followed by the major incident. You have a picture there from the 7th of July, but set piece, big incident, large fire, flooding, or a terrorist attack. And then we had crisis. Generated a lot of debate. It's one of the key themes of this presentation, really. But you know, what is it that made things a crisis? And we looked at lots of definitions, but I'm going to give you the British Standards Institute definition on the screen there. Abnormal and unstable situation that threatens an organisation's strategic objectives, reputational viability. We looked at, we had several examples. COVID-19 was obviously a forefront of a lot of people's minds. Chernobyl, the nuclear fallout across Europe. But then we actually tried to drill down, what does it mean for the police service? And if you just reflect on the, where it says their organisation's strategic objectives, and look at the primary duties, if you like, of policing. You've got protection of life and property, preservation of the peace, prevention and detection of criminal offences. Generally, you can add things to it, but that's generally the key themes. And if we take that to be the strategic objectives, anything that impacts on that will have an impact on its reputation and potentially viability. And if you look at what's happening in the United States, you can see some withdrawing funding for policing. So I think actually this is a term not used in the UK amongst policing. We could have a debate, as we did, that it should be used because it's a term of the multi-agency. It's a term recognised by corporates, by governments, and the wider field. But it's an interesting term. But what really generated discussion was this: the academics, Riddle and Webber, 1973, hierarchy of events. These three definitions, a lot of people thought were better than the ones we currently use for our incident terms. So you've got tame problems. I think the picture will give you an indication. That's your, I was about to say a routine accident, but traffic accident, but the vehicle is upside down, so perhaps not. But you get a sort of a sense there. Loosely structured, that is actually Buncefield fire, very much a major incident. Then you've got your wicked problem. That picture is taken from a TV film. But when we look at the detail that underpins these, so tame problem, normal incident, loosely structured, that's a sort of major incident, and you can look at some of the terms there, very much multi-agency. Then the wicked problem, inability to respond, rapidly degrading conditions, high time pressure, inability to prioritize. And it is that sort of thinking that generated a lot of interest. And I say a lot of interest, a lot of discussion on what it actually meant, which took us quite nicely into this sort of next session, which was around the risk assessment, controls and contingency planning. Now, we looked at a very, very simple or simplification of the process, really: risk assess, risk controls and contingency planning. And there was general agreement across all the workshops that, you know, single organisations should be doing this, should be done on a local, regional, national, and of course international. If you look at COVID, you've got the World Health Organization, you know, internationally or globally, some form of risk assessment. But this generated a lot of interest, a lot of discussion, because really the risk assessment underpins, so what are the problems? What should we do about it? The risk controls. And what do we do if it goes wrong, which is our contingency planning? And this really was sort of a lot of agreement, a lot of discussion about how good some of the processes were and how it fitted in. I'm hoping most of you should be recognizing these very basic models. So risk assess, understand the threats, what are the problems. As it says there, risk controls, let's create a range of risk controls, you know, and then finally it's our planning. So if something goes wrong, at least we've got a plan. That generated a lot of interest, and we went into some depth there about the different types of incidents and where they fitted on a matrix. But then we moved on very much into operational sort of policing type structures, and we had a very quick look at what a lot of you know as gold, silver, and bronze. I think generally this was recognised around the countries involved as whether they used the structure or not varied, but actually the actual roles performed by these people was very, very similar. They may not use the same terms. Certainly some of the Gulf countries were straight to this. They recognised gold, silver and bronze, strategic, tactical and operational. But generally, this was the principles they worked to. In some countries, of course, the strategic level was ministerial stroke government level, who gave the direction. But that was quite interesting just to reflect on the crisis response, who was taking the lead and what processes underpinned it. We looked at simplistic structures around, you know, for a single agency structure and the various roles. And as I've said, very interesting to see how it fitted together and was recognised by most. This final slide in this session, taken actually from the London 2012 Olympics, shows you sort of the scalability of the structure. This generated a lot of interest, mainly because it introduced what we know in the UK as COBRA, Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms, where the government should be setting the national strategy. And those of you followed the UK response, of course, up until very recently, it's not been doing that. It's been just England, whereas the law does allow for a national direction. But it is about coordinating the response across government and across the country, underpinned by this structure. And this generated a great deal of interest. Some of the words used on the side, directions, solutions, delivery, again of great interest in how it all fitted together. And actually some similarities. Very quickly, we had a chap from Indonesia who could see how his ministerial level fitted into this. So that was the sort of command structures. But if I'm honest, the thing that generated the most interest and engagement was this session on preparing people to work at the strategic level. And we talked about the first three core functions. Once you can imagine something has happened, it could be anything. In this case, we actually eventually looked at COVID, but something has happened. Key sort of questions are, so what has happened? This could be someone reporting to you. What is happening now? Because there could be obviously a time gap between when it happened and when it's now being reported to you. And obviously, if it was you they're reporting this to you, you'd want to know what is being done about it. But strategically, your role is the so what. What might the implications and wider impacts of this be? And it's so important to have a process to support that thinking, because this is really strategically doing some thinking. What might the implications and wider impacts of this be? And this generated a lot of interest. A tool that we've used in the UK over a number of years is this one: situation, direction, action. It caused some amusement because often the action comes first and then the direction, and very often they fail to understand the situation. But of course, when you're looking at this, you must follow it: situation, direction, action. So the situation, establish what is happening, what it means, and the direction, that's, if you like, our strategic aim and objectives. Then it's the actions, and these are at the strategic level: next steps, decisions, maintaining momentum, etc. Quite a useful tool which generated a lot of discussion. We also look very quickly at situational awareness. We have a definition from an academic by the name of Ensley there. Situational awareness: having an accurate understanding of what is happening around you, what is likely to happen in the near future. And the three pictures there talk about perception, comprehension, projection. And it is that final stage, thinking ahead. Understand it and being able to think ahead is where we're trying to get people to. And one of the tools that, again, we use in the UK is this one here, to assess the situation, its wider impacts: scale, duration, impact. I'll just spend a second on this because I think it's useful. When we talk about scale, it's how big, and it's geography. How far might this thing extend? And we're looking for a simple version. So, if you're looking at something that is perhaps in southwest London, or let's say in Wimbledon, could impact southwest London, could impact south of England. It's that type of language, quite simple so people can grasp it. But actually, when you move on to the duration, how long is it going to last? You can either do chronic, legacy, acute, chronic, and legacy, or it seems to be the preference to talk in terms of the response and recovery. Response tends to be the shorter period. Recovery tends to be far, far longer and far more complex. Then the impacts: doing what, to whom, and where. Often easy to identify the straightforward impacts, but you need a little bit of time and a process to help you identify the wider impacts. So we then took this process and we applied it to COVID-19 and looked at it from a policing perspective, which I'll just share some of the results with you. So they assessed the current situation, and if you look at, obviously we have a global audience, so it very quickly went from local to global. But what's demonstrated in front of you there is a sort of a structure that would stand scrutiny, I would suggest to you. How long's the response going to last? We talked in terms of 2 years. This actually was before the vaccine was identified, so that might reduce. Recovery, 10+ years. That's what people were thinking in terms of. And we looked at the wider impacts. Obviously, people, or humanitarian, always going to come first. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, people matter, and we must put them first. Policing came under critical national infrastructure in this particular thing. Community safety and security, economic, infrastructure, environmental, media and communications. I'll just share some of the results from our sort of online assessment. We used an impact tree. And it's quite a useful process. It's much easier if you draw it up on a screen and you're all present. But if you just think of each one of these is going to be broken down into some detail, there's one looking very quickly at the people humanitarian issues, fatalities, casualties, vulnerable, mental health and welfare. It starts to break down. And when you get on the right-hand side into some of the details, the feeling is you're starting to really understand the wider impacts and consequences. And it's quite, once you're into this process, quite an easy thing to do. I'm hoping you have a copy which you can take away and reflect on. The policing one was generated a lot of interest. Now, if you just look at this, this is part of the emergency services, part of critical national infrastructure in the UK. And if you just look at some of those headings there, so delivery of core roles, COVID restrictions, increased opportunities for crime, protest, resources obviously would come into most of these things, community confidence. Now, if you just look on the right-hand side at some of the impacts, the COVID restrictions, 200 new offences, additional demand, non-compliance, illegal gatherings, etc., etc. It is when you start to get over on the right, you start to understand the wider impacts and consequences. But we'll come back to this slide in a second just to show you there are some objectives there for policing, which would help you develop your strategy. We also looked at community safety. One of my colleagues will be speaking shortly about some of these issues. But again, just look at the detail, community cohesion, vulnerable groups, crime, just different types of crime there, street crime, domestic violence and abuse, hate crime, female genital mutilation, and modern day slavery. Prevent terrorism, courts, and then the multi-agency. And it's the detail on the right-hand side, which will give you a flavour of the wider impacts and consequences. So that normally you would do each of those as a multi-agency, preferably, but it can be done single agency. Then the next step is obviously to write a strategy, and we want some objectives. If I just go back to that slide, if you were doing this as a multi-agency, each one of those headings provides you with an objective as a multi-agency. If you want to look at it from a policing perspective, generally each one of those headings, delivery of core roles, COVID restrictions, increased opportunities for crime, give you the source of your objectives for policing. That is the process. You can have some desired outcomes. You can use this in lots of different ways. You can develop your rationale to support your strategy, which our colleague of mine, Bob Broadhurst, may speak about. Very, very important. And then obviously the next step is to, here is an example of a multi-agency strategy. So it was the next slide. Again, just take that away and reflect on it. We discussed it. It would fit in most environments. This is obviously aimed at London. But if you just think of the main headings that were talked about, you can see the process. One of the keys for this is when you're challenged afterwards, what was your assessment of the situation? Did you consider the wider impacts? You've got a process to show your thinking. And that is really what it's about. It's about showing a process of thinking, recording some information. That process generated a lot of engagement. Very interesting. People sent replies from different countries. We were able to sort of include them in some of the discussions. Very, very interesting. Then finally, we looked at what is the COVID-19 crisis. Wicked problem was the two key areas. So at least we'd come to a conclusion that we were dealing with a crisis, but the wicked problem seemed to be their favoured definition of COVID-19 and its impact on policing. So if you're dealing with it, you're now dealing with a wicked problem. I'm going to leave, it says there any questions. My colleague Bob Broadhurst will answer those for me. I'm just going to finish with this final slide really to say, the engagement. We were engaging people from numerous countries. And it was quite refreshing to hear some of the inputs, and it generated a lot of discussion. So I hope you found that useful. I'll hand over to Bob to deal with any questions, and I'll just say thank you very much and good luck in the future.